If we can get even further off topic,
Let's do it.
talk to me about this Cartesian issue about how do we know that we're not brains in vats?
Yes.
You know, essentially, how do we know that we are in reality and not in what we might do, either Plato's cave or the Matrix or however we want
Yeah,
to.
the Matrix. Yeah, yeah.
Right.
So the Matrix example today is just a modern technological version of Descartes' challenge in his method. Now, Descartes didn't doubt that he wasn't in the real world. Okay. So he wasn't a skeptic. He wasn't, I don't know if we can ever even know these things. He was a Christian. He was, I think, Jesuit. I mean, but he established a method that he thought could answer that question. And so now it's just become, and as you rightly say, it finds its origin in Platonic thinking about the disconnect between our sensory experience and ultimate reality, and the shadows versus the forms and these kind of things. So it's not new with Descartes, but he really gives it an emphasis that it really set the trajectory of subsequent philosophy on a self-destructive place, I think, personally. But at any rate,
Right.
so the Matrix is the same thing. And by the way, the only reason the Matrix illustration, not to jump ahead, works is because everybody who knows about the Matrix, none of them were in the movie. They were in the audience watching the movie. It's precisely because they're in the audience watching the movie that
Right.
they have this privileged perspective to make that example serve a question that is ultimately self-refuting. But anyway, not to belabor the point, but
Right. Right.
Descartes'
That's good.
method was he was trying to find this undoubtable fulcrum upon which everything could balance for
Right.
the rest of his understanding of knowledge. And what he did to do that was try to see if he could find anything that was impossible to doubt. And the one thing that he found to his satisfaction that was impossible to doubt was the fact that he's doubting.
Right.
Because if he doubts that he's doubting, then he's doubting. If he has no doubt that he is doubting, then he's doubting. And then he said, but doubting is basically a species of thinking. So the fact that I'm doubting, or if you will, the fact that I'm thinking, I know I must exist. And that's where his famous "I think, therefore I am"
Right.
comes into play. The problem with that statement is the I in the conclusion "I am" was already nested in the premise "I think." So of
Right.
course, once you've got an I that's thinking, you've got an I that is. Of course,
Right.
that's just a repeating, that's just a circular argument.
Right.
But at any rate, it sounded profound,
Right. Right. Right.
supposedly. Um, and so, well, here's the thing that it surfaces that I think is critically important. Back to this TED talk, even
Right.
science has shown that we really don't know reality as it is. And there are other sources that I started discovering making the same point. That so far they're largely seemingly out of the soft sciences like psychology and stuff.
Hmm.
Um, and I think what the classical tradition would insist upon is that there is nothing back behind our initial encounter with the sensible world. Now, I don't mean there's nothing back behind it, meaning a maker of that sensible world. I don't mean that. I'm talking about in terms of human knowing and experience. But by the time we're in our 20s and we start asking questions about whether we are or aren't in the matrix, by the time we do that, we've already had 2 decades of knowing lots of things.
Right.
Right? So it's not a matter of I've got to explain a certain amount in order to conclude that I know. It's really we can do philosophy to try to unpack how it is that I know, but not whether it is I know. I'm
Right.
more because how could an argument, I used to tell my students, if you're standing in front of a wall, if the wall is not enough to show you there's a wall there, how could an argument about the wall do
Right.
that? Because your argument is a step off from the wall.
Right.
So let me end with this, and then you can come back and give me some more fodder. And that, and I used the illustration. People from my generation got familiar and introduced to the expression reverse engineering, and it
Right.
grew out of the growth of the personal computer industry. And the idea was that the computers all wanted to, the personal computer on your desk, they wanted to make them operate exactly like the IBM computer. For whatever reasons, it was kind of the pace setter, and everybody wanted to, if it was IBM compatible. Now, this is not the Apple, that's a different
Right. Right.
story,
Right. Right. Right.
but the IBM compatible. Well, the IBM had a basic input output chip, a BIOS, called Basic Input Output System. And that was the heart of the way the computer was working. But what you could not do was just take an IBM BIOS chip and just copy it and make your own computer. That is illegal. So, how do we get around this? They said, so what you do, you get your engineers who don't know anything about the BIOS chip. They've never seen one, so
Right.
they can't be legally implicated. But they see what it does, all the things that it does, and then try to just create a chip and tweak it and everything to mimic everything that it does. And then you've got a chip that's tantamount to the BIOS, but you never cheated. You just said, well, it does these 612 things, and I built a chip that does all 612 of those little steps, and so it functions identical to the BIOS chip of the eye. So that's called reverse engineering. In other words, the engineer wasn't trying to invent the chip in the first place. He's trying to take what a chip already is doing and then go backwards to solve the problem. Right? So that's called reverse engineering. Now, what is an engineer, though? Well, an engineer is a person, let's say he's going to build a bridge across a crevasse. He looks at the task, he calculates what's the problem, what's the materials I need, how strong do they need to be, how long of the expanse, where do I need support, what about other environmental conditions of water and weather and things. And he figures out how to solve a problem. With the BIOS chip, he wasn't figuring out how to solve a problem because the problem had already been solved in the BIOS chip. He was figuring out how the solution worked by reverse engineering. So by parallel, when it comes to philosophy, philosophy is not trying to tell us, it's not trying to solve the problem of whether we know reality.
Right.
That's what the matrix question thinks it's asking, but the question already has made it impossible to give any answer, because I would already have to know reality in order to even know the matrix question
Right.
in the first place.
Right.
So whether I know reality is not the issue. Philosophically, that's not the issue. The issue is, how is it that I know reality? I
Right.
know that it's sunny on a clear day. And it's rainy on a rainy day. I know that. I know that my coffee is warm, and it gets cooler if I don't keep it on the coffee warmer here. And I know all these things before I was a philosopher. I think, as Frederick Wilhelmsen says in his introduction to his, I think it's his introduction to his own man's knowledge of reality, basically says, the philosopher needs to bear in mind that before he was a philosopher, he was a man or a woman.
Right.
He was a
Right.
human first.
Right.
So you think, okay, well, this is another one of the things. Well, who doesn't do that? Bad
Right.
philosophy doesn't do that.
Right.
And if you don't think bad philosophy isn't something to be contented with, C.S. Lewis said, good philosophy must exist if for no other reason than bad philosophy needs to be answered.